Hi, this is Carson with Troy, and I'm with AC Cobble. Now, AC Cobble is a fantasy author. Some of his series, or this might be all of them, unless he's working on a new one that he might talk about. I don't know. Warhite, if I said that right.
Hmm.
The King's Ranger, which is fantastic. The Cartographer and Benjamin Ashwood, which is fantastic as well. I haven't read Cartographer or Warhite yet, but if the other two series that I have read is indication, I look forward to reading those because Benjamin Ashwood and the King's Ranger is fantastic. AC, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me on. So first, like you said, AC Cobble. I've got those four series under my belt. Right now, Benjamin Ashwood was my first. Then I did the Cartographer, then the King's Ranger, and Warhite is my current project. We've got four books in that one out. I'm working on the fifth book. Hopefully, finishing that up early next year. But it kind of always when it's the season series ender takes a little bit of extra time to make sure we've wrapped everything up. But yeah, so that's what I've written. It's 19 total books now. I've been doing that for about 8 years now, most of it full time. I also run Merrick Books on the side, which is a little company that helps other authors crowdfund deluxe editions and helps distribute those. So yeah, full time in the book business these days. Um, and yeah, I've got live down in the Houston, Texas area. I've got my wife, three kids, two dogs, a cat, a lizard, and just spend all my time on books.
So yeah, full house there.
Yeah.
Well, and you just wrapped up a Kickstarter yourself.
Yes, yeah. So I'm doing my Warhite series I've been doing on Kickstarter. Just basic trade editions, hardcovers and paperbacks of those. So nothing too exciting other than just the chance to get things early. But I also just did a Kickstarter for my Benjamin Ashwood series. So it's the first book I've ever written. So I wanted to do something really special for that one. And so it's going to be a full deluxe edition. We'll have faux leather cover and foil, and we're going to have some really cool stuff that I think people haven't actually seen before, with some page edge techniques that are really new. And I haven't even seen them on a live production book yet. So it'll be fun.
Yeah, I was looking at the Kickstarter. It looks fantastic. Congratulations too.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, you could have written anything. Why did you choose to write fantasy?
It's definitely, of course, part of it is that is what I grew up reading. A lot of my favorite books that I remember from, when I was little to an adult are fantasy books. Um, so that was, pretty exciting to me to kind of, give homage to some of the books that I really enjoyed. But another part of it, because I'll read mysteries and thrillers and things like that too. But one thing fantasy gives an author is just you've got this completely open canvas to create a world that, really works well with the themes you're trying to address or the stories you want to tell. So it just gives you a lot of freedom to just be creative and come up with all kinds of crazy stuff. So whether it be, just having fun with a magic system or, creating some sort of political structure that you can explore a theme in, I just really like how free writing fantasy stories allows me to be.
So you said you grew up with it. Do you remember like the gateway books that you were like, this is awesome?
I think Robert Jordan in his Wheel of Time series was probably the most influential on me. At the time when those books were coming out, those were the ones that I was most excited about. Of course, I've read a lot of other stuff, but those are ones that I remember, being there like, oh, I can't wait till release day, and I'm gonna get this giant book and read 500 pages of it in one day. That sort of feeling is, of course, I think, something a lot of authors would love to have fans someday feel that way about their books. So,
No, Wheel of Time is my favorite series of all time, and I remember that same feeling each time the book came out. In fact, I can't remember if it was 91 or 92. I got a free like first 250 pages, like that's all they had in the book, and they were giving it away. And I devoured that thing, and I was like, okay, I got to go get the first book and finish it. Like it's such a well written story.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, and it's such a deep series that I think that's, the other thing about fantasy is you can just really dig deep and create something that people can then imagine their own stories taking place in this world. And that's when he really fleshed out well enough that you can do that.
Yeah. So while reading that series, was that the time when you were like, "This is what I want to do for the rest of my life"?
No, I was not somebody who always had dreams of becoming an author. I was always invested in stories. I loved reading stories. I liked the idea of storytelling. But in this career wasn't something I thought a lot about. It wasn't until I was probably about my late 20s or early 30s that I even started writing at all creatively. And Benjamin Ashwood was my first effort there. I spent several years on that, just kind of tinkering around with it. And I didn't really have any intentions other than just this is my hobby, telling this story. It wasn't until I actually published the book and people started reading it that it dawned on me this might be something more than just my own little hobby. So yeah, it was quite late. I think I was a late bloomer in terms of my author aspirations.
But hey, you're full time now, and you're making a living doing it. So you're doing something right.
Yeah, it's been a great career change. I mean, just the idea of you can kind of make up these stories and tell them and support a family doing that is pretty awesome.
So what was the genesis of Benjamin Ashwood? How'd you come up with the story?
So I think there was definitely, if you read it closely, there's some things you might recognize, some things from Wheel of Time and some other of my favorite series. But one thing I really wanted to do was take these kind of classic tropes that I grew up with. It's got the small party on a big adventure, but I never really bought into the concept of the chosen one and some of these things and fantasy stories. My idea was, lose the chosen one trope and explore more of how does a regular person become a hero? Because in the real world, we do have heroes born secretly the grandson of the most powerful wizard. And so, how does somebody in this fantasy world or our world gain the skills or gain the influence to go on and, save the world, basically? So that was my idea writing it was just, take kind of an everyday Joe and see what happens on their journey to fighting the ultimate bad guys and all that kind of so it's got a lot of the familiar elements but my different twist on it.
So you have four series, and they're different. When you're developing and brainstorming ideas, how do you like come up with, okay, this is a good one, I'm going to pursue it further. This one I'm going to put to the side. How do you pick which one to pursue?
I think for me there's part of it is just themes like so I mentioned that about Benjamin Ashwood, this kind of farm boy who isn't the son of a grand wizard type thing. So taking that sort of theme and then really exploring the characters and I think I have a lot of ideas running through my head, and it's just which ones click where this character and this theme seem to be a good marriage for each other, and then continuing to just explore that idea in my head for months, usually, before I'll actually start writing anything. Just if I'm walking the dog or taking a shower, just considering this character and really building out the character in my mind. I don't even take notes on it a lot of times. It's more just getting that concept fixed in my brain to the point of once I do start thinking, okay, well, what kind of world are they in? What kind of things are happening in this world? Then I can put that character in and all their reactions, all the steps they take are just natural steps based on this concept that I've been thinking about for months and months at that point.
So what's your world building process like?
So it definitely starts with the characters and starts with the themes that I'll talk about that in that story. And then, just whatever I think makes sense for that. So, obviously if this character is going to have magic, now we need to start building the world around what that character's magical skills are going to be. So a lot of it is by necessity to fit the bill for that character. And then another component is just real world travel and incorporating some things or some ideas that I've found really interesting. My Vorheit series is the one I'm working on now, and that one has a lot of Germanic influences. And a while ago, I was reading a book about the War of what is it, 1630, a 30 years war, where parts of Germany, like 60% of the population is wiped out. And you've got, religious factions, you've got different leaders from different countries, you've got local uprisings, you've got like unions, early versions of unions and things, all these different power players just fighting it out essentially. And it was, such a great idea for a fantasy story. My series is not historical fantasy by any means. There's no intent of having, actual factual information in there, but the concept of all these different, nexuses of power coming together into this big conflict was really inspiring. So I fortunately was able to go to Austria and spend some time there, eat the food, see some of the architecture, and really soak in a lot of those influences that I then wove into the story. So I've got the characters in place, I've got the themes in place, and then it's let's find some other inspiration to start building this world around those things.
So you take notes beforehand as you start writing, or when you start writing, you're like, okay, I need to research this to kind of flesh it out.
So it's I would say roughly 6 months before I'll actually start writing any words, I'm thinking about character. And then maybe 3 months before I start writing any words, I'll start digging into more of the influences to do the world building side of things. So a lot of that, of course, reading books, history books, biographies, those sorts of things that are relevant to, is there a historical figure that's similar to the characters I'm writing? Or like I mentioned, are there Germanic influences I can bring, read some things about that. And at that point, once I start reading or doing more research, is when I'll start taking notes and just start build, mostly it starts with just writing down ideas of, there's different religious factions that are battling it out. There's different political factions and start plotting out ideas before I even bother to really connect them. It's more just here's my influences. I'll get several pages of those usually, and then I can go back and say, okay, now once I've got all this put together, now what in context makes sense to actually use. And of course, a lot of that stuff doesn't end up in the book, but I'll start fleshing some things out. I'm not very much of a plotter, but I will do is write a couple pages on just the overall story arc. So, a lot of my stories involve these small parties traveling around. So, okay, they're in city A, now they're in city B, now they're in city C. Here's some main events that are going to take place in each of those locations, and then here's going to be this big fight at the end. So I'll write out that kind of overall arc and then just start writing based on, what I've got in my head of this character concept, what I've put on paper in terms of world building, and then trying to get the characters to follow this very rough arc that I've laid out, which doesn't always happen exactly as planned, but it gives me something to write toward, even if it changes.
Right. No, kind of a skeleton, and then as you're writing, you put the flesh
Yeah,
on and the skin and
yeah,
stuff like that.
exactly.
How has your process changed from the very beginning to now?
So certainly at the beginning, when I first started writing Benjamin Ashwood, there was no real process. I mean, it was just a lot of tinkering. There was a lot of rewriting, realizing I've painted myself into a corner. So it was not a very efficient situation early on. So these days, definitely a lot more care goes into the beginning to make sure I am, I am sold on these characters. I am sold on this world, and I've got all those general ideas firmly fixed in place. And then the actual writing process hasn't changed that much because I do just have that skeleton. So it gives me room to be creative and take a sidetrack if I want to. Um, and I enjoy that part about it. And then being able to go back and revise, okay, at page 300 they actually ended up doing something different than what I expected. Now I can go back and layer in some foreshadowing, change things in the beginning. I enjoy that part of the process too, of just now that I know exactly what's going to happen, I can go set it up a little better than I did originally. So my process still does involve, I think, more revision than a lot of authors, at least more than average, um, just because I enjoy that part of going back and doing the foreshadowing and coming up with wittier ways to say things now that I know more about how this story is actually going to lay out.
So when you're starting out, you're writing Benjamin Ashwood. Did you always plan for it to be a series, or as the process went on and you're writing it, you're like, this is going to be a bigger story than I thought. So I need to like figure this out.
When I first wrote it, I had there was the vague notion that it would be a series because, of course, fantasy, almost everything is series. But I didn't know if I was going to write any other books after that. It probably was about 3 years that I took to write it. And so we were having kids around the time. And, there was definitely a part of me that was thinking this might be it. So part of the ending, it's not a cliffhanger, but it leaves you with them stepping into kind of the next stage of the adventure. And part of me was thinking maybe that's just that goes unsaid until, who knows? I
Rides off
retire
into the
one day
sunset.
and, yeah. Maybe we never know what happens after that. But once I published that book, and it's probably about 2 weeks after I hit the publish button, I started realizing strangers are reading this book. It was kind of like, wait, I had some sales that's more than the friends we told today. Like, what's going on? So, maybe a month or so after that, where it's like just continuing to see there are strangers and they're leaving reviews and they seem to enjoy it. It occurred to me like I really can write more of this and I'm going to have fun doing it. So then I plotted out the whole the remaining 5 books in that series. And again, it was pretty skeletal, but the idea was, at least in book 2, I had a fairly firm arc. And then all the way through book 6, I had a pretty general idea of where they were going to go geographically, what sorts of things they were going to do there, what other main characters are they going to encounter? What other main villains are they going to encounter? And looking back on it, I'm sure a lot of that changed from my original ideas, but I think geographically they did make a loop that I had plotted out right there after book 1. So
So you said 2014 Benjamin Ashford came out. Is that correct? Or somewhere around there?
yeah, maybe 2016, I think.
2016?
Yeah.
So even back then in 2016, there was still like this stigma about indie authors, and it was unfounded because some of the best books are indie published. But you're kind of in an interesting place where you had to find your own editor, you had to find your own cover artist, even narrator for your audiobooks. How did you go about finding those people to help you?
So early on, there's a lot of like fruitless Googling and things like that. I think it helped a lot is at some point I started connecting with some other authors and building out a network of people doing similar things. Now I'm in some really good tight-knit groups that have been around for years, and so we've known each other for years. Back then, it was more just kind of reaching out to people who are writing similar stuff to what I was writing and just trying to make those connections somehow, some way. There were some things like K-boards back then, which I'm not sure if that even exists anymore. But getting into that, Reddit had some forums that I would get into. There were some Facebook groups, which I never really got a huge connection out of those. But, just trying to poke around and find communities of people doing similar stuff to what I was doing. And then once you get in there, it's like, okay, guys, who does anybody know an editor? Does it, how do you find these people? So a lot of it was referral stuff, just based on there was a lot of, I guess, probably a lot of work those first couple months of trying to figure out, how do we turn this into just a complete hobby into something more professional? Because when I did first self-publish, I had just a kind of pre-made cover that I'd probably paid like 75 bucks for. It was all self-edited. So it was a bit of a mess. And then it was after that, month or so of realizing like other people are reading this and enjoying it, was I need to get a good cover. I need to get an editor. I need to really, take the time and make the investment to turn this into something I'm not completely embarrassed about if this many people are going to end up reading it.
Well, you bring up 2 points that anybody that's beginning their journey to become an author, I think that can take away. And one is networking. You reached out and tried to find like-minded people to help you out and be a resource, and you could be a resource for them as well. And two, you just started like you put it out there, warts and all, and then like as time went on, you're like, okay, let's see if I can polish this up and make it better. So many people are so nervous to produce anything, even though it's I don't want to say like good enough, but it's good enough. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? To put it out there that you don't have to keep trying to make the Mona Lisa when something is good enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. You're never going to be successful as an author, whatever success means to you, if you don't publish the book or if you don't share the book. No matter what, that step you take at some point. And I've been to some local writing groups in the Houston area, and I'll bump into people who are just amazed that I've got books out there. And I've been working on my sci-fi book for 20 years now. And it's like, if you've spent 20 years on it, maybe it's time to just, yeah, hit the publish button and see what people think. Because I know for me personally, that was motivation. It was the motivation I needed to make it better. I think it would have been easy to kind of stop at various points and just never move forward. But when I started getting feedback, when readers started reaching out to me, when I saw reviews and worthwhile pursuit, it's not just me, I'm doing it for myself, but there's also other people who are valuing this. And so that really encourages you to take the next steps. But yeah, the first step, the first big one is making it public. And yeah, and going back to the network, I think self-publishing it's not that it's the most difficult thing. It's just there's a lot of pitfalls. There's a lot of things you can end up doing wrong that can really harm your chances. So getting that network of people who may have a little bit of experience doing one thing when you have a little bit of experience doing something else and pooling that knowledge is really helpful in avoiding making mistakes. And it also helps you fast forward through some of just the basic learning steps of you know, how do I contact editors? And somebody's like, here, just call this person. I use them. It can save you so much time and you don't have to waste time poking around on the internet. When somebody's already walked part of that path, you can follow behind them.
Exactly. Now you said, trying to make it from a hobby to a profession, you have to sell the books. What have you found success in marketing and how have you kept up with trends?
Not very well in recent years because I've been working on the side hustle a little too much. But I think a lot of it is going to be I think when people get marketing advice, a lot of times it's an author saying, this is what I did. And so people are going to try and replicate that exactly. What I recommend is you get that network, you follow other authors, even if you're not talking to them, watch what they're doing and seeing how they're reaching out to people. So sign up to newsletters for people who are writing similar type books to you and doing it successfully. Follow people on social media, get into those little groups, pay attention to advertising on Amazon or Facebook, see what they're doing that connects with you and what doesn't connect with you, and then start building your own marketing plan based on what you're motivated to do. So a lot of times, there's people who love digging into the numbers of ads and tweaking different formulas and getting their targeting just right. And if you enjoy playing with that sort of thing, then great, go ahead and do it. But if you hate that sort of thing, then maybe you're better off spending your time building out a newsletter, or maybe you're better off interacting a lot on social media and building networks there. It wasn't as much of a thing, I think, back in 2016 when I was starting, but now there's so many authors who build these like huge followings on TikTok and other places before they even launch the book. And that's hugely beneficial to them. But if that's not your personality, it's a really tough thing to do. I mean, that's something I would never be able to do because that's just not something I would enjoy. And so I'm just going to end up either not doing it all or just kind of doing a halfway job of it. But when you've got that right personality, it can be extremely effective. And so it's just figuring out on this whole landscape of opportunities, which top opportunities make the most sense to you. People go to conventions and things like that. That's something I've never really done in terms of like direct sales to people in person. But there's others who are incredibly successful at it because they enjoy going and doing those sorts of things. And so that's what I would really recommend for anybody trying to get started or trying to elevate is look at what everyone else is doing and then what parts of those are you going to enjoy because those are the ones you're really going to put your most time and effort into doing.
So you said you're finish up the last book of Warhite. Um, what do you have planned after that?
I don't know. It'll probably be early next year by the time I get done with it, and that kind of puts me into my 6 month range of needing to start thinking about other characters and other situations. I did just write a couple short stories for some anthologies that came out recently, and so I'm kind of thinking about those concepts and if I can build them into something bigger. One of them was like a little. It was basically this guy could see the future, and he was possibly immortal, or at least, had some sort of long lifespan. I didn't dig into the whys of that, but the idea was the gods had cursed him with the ability to see the future, and how on the surface you think, oh, this is going to be this wonderful thing. But over time, that's not that wonderful because you already know like what your greatest joy is going to be. There's no anticipation anymore. There's no thrill of discovery for this guy. And so it kind of turns him into a bitter, angry sort of guy at the gods, and he's out now seeking revenge. So that was one idea. And then the other one was a druid who's in this world where these sorcerers basically drain all the resources for an area to fuel their magical powers. And so there's this organization of druids that, we think about them dancing in the forest with little animals and things like that. But to fight back against these sorcerers, this organization of druids needs somebody who can fight. And so he's a druid, but also um, has combat skills, and he's going after these sorcerers. And so that was kind of an interesting idea also. Whether or not I end up expanding on those or not, I'm not sure. But those are two recent short stories I wrote and took that chance to kind of explore some different ideas and see what I liked about them.
So when you're plotting out a new series, do you have like a publishing goal of like I want to get each book every 3 months, every 6 months, every year? Like what's kind of your process with that?
I used to. Up until the last year and a half or so, I would have a fairly firm timeline on wanting to do 2 books a year, is what I've done most of my career. During COVID, I got up to four because I didn't have a whole lot else going on like everybody else. But now I've kind of fallen off that, and it's more like one a year now, and the timeline's not nearly as fixed because I'm spending a lot of time doing other things. But I do think it's very helpful for me, and I think a lot of other people, to give yourself that firm timeline. Because I know for me, it's especially with writing where maybe it's taking you 6 months to write a book, maybe it's taking you a year to write a book. It's very easy to have those days where you're like, yeah, I mean, I don't really have any hard deadline today, so I'm just gonna not do it today, or find something. I'm gonna spend my time on the internet or something like that. So I really like having hard deadlines in terms of, by December I'm gonna finish, this rough draft, and then I back it out where, okay, that means by the end of this week, I need to write 20,000 words. And so give myself like almost like a weekly schedule of where I should be if I'm going to hit that deadline.
Well, let's talk about some of your habits for writing. Do you sit down at a certain time of day, or do you just set a goal? Okay, I'm going to write, I don't know, 10,000 words a day or 5,000 words today. And you're like, as long as I get that before I go to bed, like what are some of your habits?
So a lot of times when I've got a writing day, in the mornings, I'll be checking messages, catching up with my networks of authors, things like that. Looking at, sales, or if I'm running any ad campaigns, just basically catching up on all the admin. Then usually by mid-morning, I try and start writing a little bit. And usually I don't get very much done in that session, but I'll kind of think about what I wrote the day before, and then I'll think about what I want to write today. Um, and maybe spend an hour and a half kind of tooling away at it. And usually, like I said, don't get much done, but then I'll go either walk the dogs, get lunch, do something to move my body around a little bit, and then I come back in the afternoon, and that's really when I get the bulk of the writing done, because I've gotten rid of the admin stuff, so I don't have anything I need pressing on my plate that's distracting me. And then I've kind of thought about the story, taken a break, and considered, what are my plans, what's going to happen next in this chapter. And so hopefully by afternoon I've got a firm idea of like, okay, this is what they're going to say next, this is where they're going to go, and then boom, I can kind of get a lot of writing done, hopefully, if things are working well. Then sometimes you'll stumble across scenes that just take a long time and you got to spend a lot more time on it. But that's the theory, at least for me, is get to that afternoon point where I've got things kind of figured out in my head at least, so I can put them down on paper.
So you're a husband, a father. You know, you run a side business. How do you stay balanced? What do you do for fun?
It's tough. These days, a lot of times it seems like we're just going to the kids' sporting events and things like that. Um, some of the things you know, I enjoy doing those. So, that's part of it. Spending time with friends too kind of gets me out of the book world a little bit. A lot of the people we know, our neighbors, things like that, um, aren't authors, aren't involved in any sort of book industry stuff. So it kind of gives me a little bit of a cleanse when I can talk to people about something completely different. So whether that be like the kids' sports or just, whatever we happen to have going on. Then also I mean, in terms of hobbies, like I like to cook, so that's kind of my shut off the working side of the day is I'll go in and start making dinner. Gives me that chance to like kind of transition into the evening and relax and, go through that different stage of the day. And then long term, I like to travel a lot. So thinking about travel, planning things out, that kind of gives me something to look forward to other than just planning out the end of this book is like, okay, there's something else I've got on the horizon that I can kind of think about and plan for.
So you have any big travel plans in 2025 that you're thinking about going to?
Yeah, we've got like to do a ski trip every year, go up into Colorado or somewhere else. We've got big place down in Orlando. I think we need to take the kids to. We've been promising for years and haven't gotten around to. And then hopefully my wife and I are the kids may be going to camp in the next summer and we may go down to Mexico City, just the two of us. And so that'll be a big one for us. And I'm excited about trips like that because that does get me out of my comfort zone, go to a place I've never been before and see some things that are different from my normal daily experience. And that sort of stuff, is enjoyable just being there in the moment, but also gives me inspiration, hopefully, for something that may work its way into my books time down the road.
No, that's always a palate cleanser. If you have something that you can just kind of shut your mind off, whether that's you mentioned cooking or going on these trips, it's valuable to have those for sure.
Yeah, I think one thing that's hard for authors a lot of times is separating the work and the life because there's no end to our job. You're writing a book, you finish that book, but there's always another book. So, in theory, you just literally have an endless pile of work at all times. You've got to find ways to kind of shut that off, at least temporarily, and focus on something else. And because is for me at least, it's the inspiration or the experiences I have in life that work their way into my stories that make them interesting and exciting and relatable for people. So you've got to spend some time living life if you're going to write about it. Um,
No, exactly. Now you mentioned inspirations. Who in the fantasy world? You mentioned Robert Jordan. Who have been some of your influences?
Robert Jordan, I think, is certainly, one of the genesis, I guess, of how things got started. Um, these days I try and read a lot more broadly and pick up different pieces here and there. I just got done with a book by John Gwynne, which I really enjoyed. And it was, he's of course got a lot of like Nordic, Viking type stuff. And so that's something I haven't really had in any of my stories, but reading through, I'm not sure that I'm going to write a Viking story, but he does such a great job with fight scenes. He does such a great job of having little bite-sized chapters where, it's very action-packed and it just keeps you, the pace of his writing is really brisk. So that was one I think in terms of a recent inspiration, it was probably I could see myself in my next series trying to incorporate some of that writing style where really increasing the pace, where he's got, big, long, epic series, but it doesn't feel like you're in the middle of this slog. I think about Robert Jordan today. If I started that again, I'm not sure if I could get through, what is it, 14 books, I think, it's such a long experience and such a commitment. where I was like, you can still tell epic stories at a much quicker pace and, more bite-sized portions. Um, and then, I like to read a lot of nonfiction and things like that too. Just, behavioral psychology is an area of science that I think is really interesting and something I think works its way into my writing, trying to understand how people think. And then, we put them in some sort of crazy fantasy situation and how would people react to that? Uh,
No, that definitely helped you, not only with writing and with your characters on different situations, but behavioral psychology on marketing and stuff like that as well.
mhm.
So I think that's another nugget that somebody can pull out of this episode is not just hone in on a certain thing, but read widely and not fiction and nonfiction to hone your skill.
Yeah, I think there's obviously there can be a lot of advantages of reading deeply in your genre, what you want to write about. But I think there's just as much value in reading completely different stuff. I mean, you know, maybe you're not writing a romance, but there could be characters in a relationship or thinking about a relationship in your book. So there's things you can draw from romance. Maybe you're not writing about modern day spy thrillers, but again, I mentioned the pacing with John Gwynne. Pacing on thrillers is so quick. And, I mean, that's why, everybody's reading those on airplanes and stuff like that is because it's such a brisk read. I think there's something we can learn from that in fantasy and incorporate that sometimes. So, yeah, I would encourage people read all kinds of genres of fiction and then, find things that are nonfiction that are interesting to you. There's a lot of, history has so many wild and crazy things that have happened that we wouldn't be believed if we put it into a fantasy book. But, learning about that kind of stuff, even if it's not a direct inspiration, I think can be helpful in crafting our stories.
Isn't that funny though? Because you're writing a fantasy novel and you'll say something and somebody will come to you. That would never happen in real life. And like I just barely like drew inspiration from real life, and
Yeah,
it did
yeah.
happen. Well, do you have any final tips or tricks that you could share?
I think the biggest thing is we kind of already touched about it, but for somebody who's thinking about writing or wanting to get deeper into the world of writing, the biggest thing is to just do it. You know, you made a comment earlier on in the interview about how self-publishing had a stigma about it. And I think what's interesting now is I know hundreds of authors through being an author through Merrick Books. I've gotten to know so many people, and we've got traditional published people, self-published people. I was just doing some holiday shopping and saw on some end caps at a Target some New York Times bestseller books, and I realized I know a lot of these people. They were independent authors. My narrator is got this New York Times best-selling book out there that's at an end cap of a big box retailer. And the thing that we all have in common is every single one of us starts with this blank page. There's nothing that's different in the process of a New York Times best-selling author or somebody who is just now working on their first self-published novel. People get this imposter syndrome, but every single one of those famous authors started in the exact same place that you're at right now in terms of just trying to get that story out there. And even after that person has gotten a traditional publishing deal, they're still starting the exact same way. Every time they start a new story, it's just the same blank page that we all have. Um, One of the key differences sometimes is they just get out there and do it. And, maybe people will connect with your story, maybe they won't, but you'll never find out until you write it and get it out there. So that's
No,
my advice. Just
that's
get out
great
there and do it.
advice. That's awesome. Well, tell everybody how they can get a hold of you. And is you mentioned that you don't go to many conventions, but if you are in 2025, go ahead and let people know where they'll be able to see you.
The easiest way to get a hold of me is acobble.com. That's ACCOBBLE.com. Got a contact form on there. In terms of getting out there to conventions and things like that, I have never been to this, but there's a Houston Comic Con in May that I think this year I'm going to go to. Other than that, it'll probably be mostly some author conventions, some things like that. I have no firm plans. But last year, 2024, I did not make my way out to any author-based things, but I think in 2025, I'm going to try and get back out on the road and get out and see some people again.
Perfect. So if you make it to that convention and AC is there, go ahead and say hi and buy his books because they're fantastic. And AC, I thank you for coming on today. I appreciate it and learned a lot from you.
All right, thanks. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for listening to the Troy Podcast. Please subscribe, like, and share with your friends.